submarine cables. Roughly 428 submarine cables, roughly. These superhighways total over 1 million miles of glass laid and buried around the world, around the planet. Some as deep, as high as Mount Everest. And in the last 2 years, there's been about $8 billion invested in submarine cables. So that gives you a sense of the enormity of the things that we're talking about, and all of you that are experienced certainly in putting in cable projects do understand how incredibly complex and incredibly detailed a lot of this work is. So with that, good morning, aloha, welcome to Hawaii. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tony Mosley, as Arlene pointed out. We've had a bit of a time over the past few weeks trying to get some of these sessions together, but we have a great group of panelists today. And we did something a little bit different this time. And let me go through and put up the introductory slide here. AV guy. There you go. Okay. Paul, as Elaine mentioned, has taken a bit of a break, and when we talked about it, he wanted to take a little bit of time out. Is Paul here today? Is he anywhere back here? But we talked. Is he? Oh, there we are. And the reason I'm here is because I won the Paul McCann lookalike contest. But it's okay. We're good. And one thing he mentioned to me, and we talked a little bit about it earlier. He said, "This will be a little bit of cat herding for you, so get ready for it." But I really would like to thank Paul and Elaine for dragging me into this. And it's been a real learning experience, and there are a lot of exciting things going on in this industry. So it really is important and incredible work. We have a great group of presenters this year, and we'll talk to everything about all the new cable bills and a little bit of regulatory as well for 2019. And we've done something a little bit different. We've asked each one of the presenters to talk about not only the new cable projects, but also the challenges in region to them. And then we'll have a little bit of Q&A and discussion afterwards if we have enough time for it. The Pacific. And last and certainly not least, Kent Bressie will cover the regulatory challenges of the day. So with that, we'll get on with it. And I'd like to call Gil Santeliz, who's the CEO of New Jersey NJFX.
Great,
thank you.
Great, thank you for having me, totally appreciate it, and aloha to everyone here. A little bit about myself. Prior to being the founder and owner of NJFX, I used to own a company called 4 Connections. And 4 Connections was needed back in 2000 and 2005 was clarity. Clarity about how my communication network works. In the New York metro market, we're blessed to have the financial community call it its home. And we had entities like NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, Lehman Brothers when it existed back then, now Barclays Bank, and a multitude of banks that were always asking, when my data leaves my data center, how does it get to the next data center? And back in the day, the answer was best efforts. It's carry great, best efforts between A and B. And we did a great job in providing dark fiber infrastructure in those days, provided a lot of clarity for these banks so that they knew exactly the routes, they knew diversity, how it worked in terms of dark fiber, and they had the economies of scale. They had owner economics, which I'm going to come back to in a few minutes in describing how these subsea networks have evolved. But the dark fiber community today is pretty robust, it's mature. Everyone accepts it as the best way to connect between your two sites when you can. So, after taking a couple of years off and having a nice beach house down near Wall, New Jersey, one of the ideas was, why don't we create a better place to interconnect our subsea networks? Why don't we create a place where dark fiber networks can properly address a cable landing station? And that's how NJFX came about. It was really an idea of saying cable landing stations traditionally were these quiet places that no one really knew about. Not a lot of foot traffic existed. They weren't built very robust in a tier 3 fashion, so we came up with NJFX as a carrier-neutral cable landing station. And again, being so close to my home, I really enjoy working there, spending time, being a mile away from the facility. So let me walk you guys through some of the changes, and how do I flip to the next slide? It's just the down button? Yeah. Right. So what I was asked to share is to give you a little bit of spend a fortune building a front haul system that's still in place today, has been really well maintained. In some parts of the U.S., they're not going to be so lucky. They're going to be doing a greenfield project. In some parts of the U.S., they'll be landing cables where it might not have been done before, and they're going to experience for the first time what it's like to own a cable system in a part of a country where, you know, the ship trafficking might not be as well vetted over a 20-year period as locations that are a little bit more mature. So the new cables come on board. As the new cables come on board, I think we all know who the owners are in the new systems. They're the ones that were really driving the traffic in the past. Those older cable systems had as anchor tenants the new investors in the new subsea systems. So now you've got a new cable system. It's got newer economics. It's going to be more favorable in terms of throughput on their cable. And as those new cables come online and become active, there's going to be some pressure. Not on the technology behind the older cable system, purely on the economics. So if you're running a system today and you've got some great anchor tenants and they're chipping in for the O&M, if they choose to not contribute to that O&M as they go forward their new systems, because they have their own cable with better technology, better communication infrastructure, and they leave those older systems, now the challenge becomes. So we put out a theory that in the next 5 years, within the next 5 years, the Atlantic Ocean will look dramatically different. So here's the Atlantic Ocean for you in 2025, and some folks will say some of the systems that are consortium cables might not even last till 2020, 2021. And what happens when you start going from 14, 15 cables down to 5, how do I plan? How does the enterprise customer that gave the incumbent 20 years ago the request to make sure my network always works, and I'll call for the US, the incumbents of AT&T and Verizon, tell their customers, how do I plan for your migration? As the older cable systems start taking on the challenge of, I don't have the economics to make this work for myself, how do I pick a day where I turn that cable off? And then did I tell everyone along the way that the cable was going to be turning off next year? And as we know, everyone buys from everyone in the very collaborative industry that we're in. Did someone get left behind? So one of the things that we've done at NJFX is taken the time to start educating the largest banks in the US in terms of this change that's going on. And we have events at the building called SubTelForums. And as we bring them in, we introduce them to the new cable owner operators. We introduce them to the folks that are buying on the now secondary market, because that's what's left. On the new stable systems, you've got owners that aren't the traditional owners of 20 years ago. These owners are really single-purpose operators at times. They're the ones that are really going out there and taking the time and energy to develop these cable systems the right way. They're taking the time to get backhaul provided to the cable landing station. And let me bring that back a different way. What did we do 20 years ago? We landed cables in the United States. We ran to the biggest metro we can find. It was called the Lower Manhattan. And there we decided to go ahead and interconnect all this traffic, billions of dollars of traffic in Lower Manhattan. Well, in the year 2001, we had our unfortunate 9/11. You know, in 2012, we had Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, where we came within inches of New York City having catastrophic failures. And we had all that capacity not available at cable landing station in New Jersey or Long Island or Virginia, where we have it available today. It was all sitting in Lower Manhattan in an office building called 60 Hudson Street that was never meant to do what it's doing. So the new systems now are taking the time to realize, I can't put all my eggs in one basket in an office building in Manhattan. I've got to try and disseminate across. So these new cable systems are being architected in a much smarter way. A lot more thought is being put into the diversity of it. In our case, our cable landing station is not just a building, it's also a campus. We have 48 acres available. We are carrier neutral in the sense that we don't care in terms of what you want to do on property. You can compete with others in an open environment. It's fair. You can have your own building if you'd like. These new systems are dramatically better than the older systems from an architecture standpoint. So as customers continue to start leaving the systems, it's not the technology that's going to hurt the older systems, it's just the way they were structured, their economics. So now, looking at 2025, this is the picture, and there's some systems that are in the process of being announced that aren't on this sheet, but that's going to help with some of the congestion. The question is, are we going to have the traditional incumbents supply and demand? We've grown up in an industry where it constantly goes down every year. But if you start having only a few operators controlling that primary owner economics, you might see prices actually increase. You might see premiums paid to get onto diverse networks. So that's a picture of what we're seeing in terms of the before and the after. The question is, before is today, the after is to be determined, whether it's 1 year out, 3 years out, 4 years out. Will this happen in other parts of the world? I'll let my panel kind of share with us in terms of how Europe might work or Africa. But we're a pretty mature market in the Atlantic when it comes US, Europe, into Brazil. This is what we're seeing going forward. Do I hit enter to the next page?
Down arrow.
Down arrow. You would think I know how to do this, right?
Budding AV guys.
Great. So I have one more slide to kind of share in terms of how the new systems compare to the old systems. And if you're familiar I'm going to call this much more in the enterprise space. There's going to be disruptions. We're going to see outages. You know, last year we had 2 major carriers have outages across the United States. CenturyLink had one December 27th. Comcast had one. There was outages where folks had no idea they were actually a customer of CenturyLink because their carrier bought along the way. They thought they had diversity. And because the way these networks are now so integral part of our life, you know, things have to work. You know, when we talk to the biggest banks in the US, we say, my fear is that your network system and your banking system might not work one day, but I know my Facebook account will work that day. I know my Google account will work that day. How are you guys going to ever be as good as those guys are? You've got to start looking at how to invest properly. You've got to start learning this. You can't just be a customer and ask an incumbent to provide you a service. You've got to take the time to roll up your sleeves and see how these networks are designed and built, how you're getting to a cable landing station. They're not all the same. Some of them are going to be at parts of the coast where they might be in jeopardy for storms. We've taken the time to pick a location that's 65 feet above sea level and really taken every precaution we can. But when you look for diversity, the United States along the coast, unfortunately, it's called sea level, and there's not many spots you can actually get there that high. But in this transition, you know, outages are going to happen, and unfortunately, outages are something that we no longer really have much of a threshold for, because outages mean that the things that are most important to us in our pockets and our phones aren't going to work for periods of time. And there's some applications that are really important for the economy to always move forward. So in summary, the change is happening. We're in the midst of it today. We've got leaders in the industry that have taken the role of the newer systems and designing them properly. But I think there's room for the incumbents that built the systems 20 years ago to be able to collaborate, to be able to explain how the capillarity works once they enter into countries that others might not be as familiar with. And if you can see those two start to work together, I think the disruptions will be less. If you see folks that are being isolated and saying, I'm in denial, my cable's not going to go away, I'm not going to work with the new guy, then you could start seeing some changes, especially for late adopters. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Gil. Our next presenter, who's been a great substitute and has been extremely helpful in getting these together, getting these slides together. Eric Contag, if you could please come up. Thank you.
A quick update on what's happening in our neck of the woods in Latin America. If I can find it down here we go. So some of the things that we are seeing or in our market are no different from what you're seeing around the world. So we've gone from we can have different, totally diverse routes to be able to protect, let's say, the services that we provide and address some of the issues that perhaps Gil was mentioning before. I think in the late 90s, cables were built as consortia. Typically, you had the incumbents in each one of the countries basically sharing in a monopolistic way the cables. Very difficult to operate. Decisions would take forever. And the early 2000s brought on a new way of doing things through the launch of private cable systems. I think over the years, we basically reviewed the models, and where we are today is in a different setup where we actually see joint build agreements and partnerships, perhaps for people that, or with entities that used to be our customer's customer. So we, for example, as GlobeNet, have recently entered into partnership with Facebook to build a cable into Argentina. And I think these type of joint builds, joint partnerships you will continue to see not only in the Americas and the transatlantic, but around the world. When you think of the minimum investment unit, I mean, in the model where everything was shared, you shared equipment, you shared landings, you had rules to getting in and out of cable landing stations. Today, the minimum investment unit is a fiber pair, and pretty much whoever owns that fiber pair, you can put whatever equipment you want on it, you can upgrade it whenever you want on it, you have all this flexibility, because the dynamics of, let's say, one of the members of the joint build agreement can be totally different from that of the other member. And I think this is something that we're definitely seeing throughout the world. I think that neutrality is absolutely relevant, and being able to get in and out of landing facilities and data centers, et cetera, is also key for the health of the industry. And definitely all the very large system builds are being driven by the large-scale OTTs, mainly Google and Facebook, but I also see activity by Microsoft and Amazon. So let me show you what our landscape looked like a couple years ago. In the early 2000s, you basically had 3 new modern optical cable systems. The first one to be laid was the SAM-1 from Telefonica that circumnavigated Latin America. Then you had Global Crossings that had the MAC, Mid-Atlantic Crossings, and SAC that was circumnavigating Latin America. And then you had GlobeNet that had a dual ring system, mainly on the Atlantic side of the network. And then if you take a look at 2018, and thanks to Telegeography for allowing me to use their data, you will see that you have a lot more systems in the area. You're going to see that some cables, for example, emanating out of Fortaleza in Brazil, pointing at Africa or perhaps Europe. And you're going to see a slew of new systems that have come online or are coming online since 2014. So what's the status of these new systems? I'm going to step through them briefly. Telmix. So for those of you that don't know Latin America very well, you have basically 2 large groups that were dominating the region. You have Telefonica that was serving many countries, and you have Mexicans, Telmix, that were serving the other countries, with Telecom Italia following as a leader in the cellular space. And so they were all just local operators in each country, and eventually the Mexicans decided that they needed to have their own infrastructure. And I'd say 8 to 10 years in the planning, they decided to build AMX. That cable became ready for service in 2014. And it's a system that we don't really see as a competing system because it's only being used to service their own properties throughout the region. PCCS, or the Pacific Caribbean Cable System, is a consortium in the traditional way, led by Telxius and Cable & Wireless, and they have Telconnect from Ecuador, Sitar from Aruba, and there's also Curaçao in the mix. And this is more of the traditional way of doing things. They needed another cable, they needed diversity. It was great business for Telefonica to have 2 routes out of Ecuador and another route out of Colombia, and they went ahead and created this project. And this is actually an offshoot of an initiative that AT&T had started probably in 2008 or so, when they were thinking of building another huge consortia cable around Latin America that didn't go through, and now PCCS is there. It's more of a regional play. On the big US to Brazil route, where you have probably 10 times more traffic than anywhere else in Latin America, there's a series of new cables that have come to market. Cbras 1 is a 6 fiber pair system, 3 of them under IRU to Telecom Italia Sparkle. Then you have Monet, which is more of a traditional consortium cable, was led by Google, with Antel from Uruguay, Algar as a CLIC in Brazil, and Angola Cables that was making their landfall in Brazil. Tanat is an extension to some extent of Google. It's another cable system that Google was driving that goes from São Paulo in Brazil down to Uruguay. And Google's first project to build a cable that they own themselves, control and manage themselves, which is Junior. It's a regional system built by Patek that connects Rio with Santos. And then the more recent large-scale system that came on the US-Brazil route is BRUSA, owned by Telxus. It's an 8-fiber pair system. The other two, or the other systems that I have listed here, were typical 6-fiber pair systems. And this one has Telefonica, their internal company, as a main anchor, Facebook, and perhaps others. And then you have two projects that are actually very interesting into Latin America because they actually have different routes. So Angola Cables started a project called SAX that connects Luanda with Fortaleza. That actually was built by NEC with funding from the Japanese Development Bank and the Angolan Development Bank. And it became the first cable to hook up sub-Saharan Africa with Brazil. The second project is on a similar route. It connects Fortaleza in Brazil as well to Cameroon. And this cable was sponsored by China, and it was the first Huawei transatlantic cable system. Both of these are RFS, or became RFS at the end of 2018. But there are other systems as well, and some that are in process of being laid and some that are in process of being developed. As I mentioned earlier, we partner with Facebook to build Malbec, which is a cable that is being built between Rio and Santos and Las Toninas in Argentina, and it's the first cable system to reach Argentina in about 15 years. Curie is another Google initiative designed by Google, and it's a Google cable. And if I understand correctly, last week or perhaps this week, Subcom is landed the cable and is in Los Angeles and starting to go south to connect with Chile, where Google happens to have a data center. Now, this is interesting for those that are carriers in the sense that many of these systems that are being driven and sponsored by OTTs in reality are there for machine-to-machine communication. They're connecting data centers. So the architecture of Google is you have several data centers around the world, and they decided to build a large-scale 30-megawatt facility in Chile. And so obviously they need to have a lot of communication to go from their Chile data center to the data centers that they have in the United States. So this is a cable that will probably be launched with, I think, slightly shy of 10 terabits of capacity on day one to enable that communication. Chile as a country probably doesn't even need more than a terabit. So this kind of gives you a sense of the amount of data that is going back and forth between data center facilities. Other projects that I believe will potentially happen is TANAT may potentially be extended. There's not an announcement to that, but it makes logical sense. Seaborn has announced also the Arbor cable, the Argentina-Brazil cable, going from Santos to Argentina. Now here's an interesting fact. If you look at Latin America and Argentina in particular, it used to be a top country in the world's economy prior to the Second World War. And for the last 15 years, it just kept going straight down into the abyss. And because of political change, the country's slowly starting to take off. And it's not going to be an easy ride. If we would have not partnered, for example, with somebody like Facebook, the economics of building the cable and the returns that our shareholders expect would have been very difficult to materialize. So that's something else. If you start looking at the developing world, you need to have patience. You need to be willing to take risk. And you know that you're going to get a payback many years from now. It's not going to be, let me flip this asset in the short term. So let's look at other interesting projects in Latin America. The Chilean government sponsored a cable called Fibra Austral. That's another Huawei built. This is the type of project that is not commercially viable. There's not really the demand for people, but there's a need for communication. There's a need to be able to reach outlying cities and villages in Tierra del Fuego, just north of Antarctica. And it was because Chile realized that it is very difficult to serve some of these cities with modern high bandwidth communications, that it was better to build a subsea cable system than to continue to invest in satellite services that, by the way, are difficult to capture in the southern hemisphere. Another interesting project, Bolivia, that is a landlocked country, needed another exit. And so what they did is they figured out, let's build a cable basically right down the river from Bolivia into the Pacific coast and then go up to Lima and from there connect to the rest of the world. It's a project that is also being manufactured, the cable's being manufactured by Huawei. Chile government is also supporting a festoon cable system. And it's difficult. Chile is a very, very long country. And building terrestrial networks is very hard. The geography is complicated, and there's nothing in the middle. So by putting in a fiber optic subsea cable system as a festoon, it guarantees communication to copper mines and other cities that are critical for the Chilean economy. And a little bit further north, if we go to the Caribbean, we have Deep Blue. That is a project of laying actually quite a comprehensive architecture to connect Caribbean islands with Miami, perhaps south into Panama or Colombia, and extend into the Guyanas. I know that the Deep Blue team is actively working on this Caribbean network, and perhaps this year you can expect some announcement in terms of surveys or others in order to make this cable a reality. And here is the next phase, connecting continents. Most of the traffic and most of the networks that were built into Latin America were north-south. And it was simple. The content, mainly the internet, resided in the United States. And so therefore you justified all these cables from Brazil to the US, from Colombia to the US, from Latin America to the US, because that's where you were picking up content. There is one cable system that was built from Brazil to Europe called Atlantis II, and that is really a great design, but it's a failure as a cable system because it's a consortium that pretty much blocked both ends of the cable. So there's very little traffic on that particular system. The cable's also probably in its year 15 or 18 with very little of operation. And the team from Elalink has been persistent, and they've been at this for about 8 or 10 years. And just at the end of December, we got the announcement that they closed the agreement of the landing in Cape Verde. They received funding from the European academic institutions and for a project called Bella, and that plus investment from Marguerite is enabling the construction of Elalink. SAX is another project, South Atlantic Express, that has been in the works for many years. It seems that they're getting much closer to financial close, and that's a project that would link South Africa to Virginia Beach with a landing in Fortaleza. And one of the things that I need to say is both of these projects, you have people that are passionate about subsea, they're passionate about the opportunity, and for many, many years they've been going at it, and hopefully they will be both successful in the deployment of their projects. And the other project that was announced by Seaborn was the South Africa to Brazil cable, SABRE, for RFS in 2021. Only time will tell. Perhaps next year at this conference, we'll see if any one of these 3 projects are actually being implemented, but they definitely seem much closer to reality than before. So to wrap up Latin America in terms of challenges and opportunities and trends that we see in the region, this is perhaps not too different from the rest of the developing world. There has been a geopolitical shift in Latin America. If you look at the countries 10 years ago, most of the countries were perhaps very heavily leaning towards the left. Today, 10 years later, they're more stronger democratic, let's say, countries. There is renewed investment, so people feel comfortable. You know, banks are more willing to fund projects, etc. I think a challenge that we see throughout the world, and definitely Latin America, is permitting. And I think Kent's going to be talking about that later. But what I can tell you from Brazil, for example, is that everybody that was trained in the early 2000s, because of all the systems that were built, for example, into Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil, those people are retired or left because we didn't have new cables coming into the region. And so the new systems that have landed, that are listed in particular in Brazil, it was a re-education of people, and the permitting process is actually quite complex. And I think governments are always lacking in terms, and they're behind of what needs to be done, and definitely permitting is a key issue to be able to continue to deploy more infrastructure in the region. I think from a demand perspective, telegeography has been always predicting over the last several years, 30, 35, 40, 45%. Very strong CAGR. I think that will continue to be the same over the next many years to come, and hence the need for additional and very robust infrastructure. Some of the other problems that we have seen is price erosion. It was really in free fall in one of the most lucrative markets, let's say, in the subsea industry. We see the same type of pricing pressures that perhaps others were seeing in the Atlantic several years ago. I think that from a carrier perspective, the addressable markets are getting smaller because the OTTs are building their own private networks, and local operators are peering directly in country rather than buying capacity in subsea systems. So we see that as a trend, and the question is, when are we going to see the next YouTube in the market, or the next app that's going to drive additional demand, let's say, in our region? So I believe that some of the systems were built, let's say, in the 90s, are going through their last upgrades, and in the next 5 years, we're going to see some of these come to term. Gil mentioned earlier perhaps the difference between design life of 25 years, that now we talk about maybe 30 for a modern cable system, versus economic life, where it doesn't make sense anymore to maintain a legacy system. It's rather better to put our eggs in a brand new cable system market, and so on. I think the last point that I wanted to mention on the slide is the fact that we are starting to see the deployment of new internet exchange points throughout the region, making it easier for networks to communicate. We happen to have one in Fortaleza that almost happened by accident, because nobody thought that Fortaleza in Brazil is going to become this very large point of interconnection of US-Brazil cables, Brazil-Argentina cables, and Brazil-Africa cables. And with that, I finish the update on South America. So, should we take questions now or go into the next?
No, just keep.
Just keep going? All right. So you're going to have me here for a couple more minutes. I know very little about Africa. But given that our friends from Angola Cable could not make it today, the slides were very good, and what they are seeing are not undifferent from what you have witnessed in Latin America. I volunteered to step in and provide you an overview of Africa, and I'm going to ask Ian and others in the panel to step in and fill in the blanks. So there's a series of projects in Africa as well. I think Africa as a continent, if you look at the telegeography map, you're going to see many cables that are circumnavigating the continent. And that is very similar to what we had in Latin America. WAX is a modern cable system, a relatively modern cable system. It's a consortium. ACE is another one that is serving the countries in Africa. And you have others that have been there for, let's say, for a very long time. The problem that Africa faces, at least in my opinion, is not different from what we have seen in some other developing countries and what we have seen in South America. There is displacement, or perhaps things are not happening concurrently. You build a subsea cable system, and the terrestrial part is just not there. So I was lucky to participate in some conversations with a close friend of mine in the OTT industry that said, how can we serve Nigeria? I said, I don't know much about Nigeria. He said, well, there's about 200 million people there, and geographically it's about the size of Brazil, so it shouldn't be that difficult. So we sat there for a while. We looked at Nigeria, and if you look at the map, you see that there's tons of cables actually serving Nigeria, and yet the penetration is very, very low. And what happens there is that you just don't have the infrastructure inside of the country to be able to deliver services to your users. The infrastructure has not been built. So there's many projects in Africa to connect the West Coast with the East Coast, to connect Africa, let's say, to other continents, or to use Africa as a diverse route for cables that are going across from Asia to Europe to the US through the Suez Canal. So some of these projects that have been discussed, some are being constructed. We talked about the South Atlantic Crossings Cable that connects Luanda with Fortaleza, so that one was done, it's RFS. SAIL is the other project that I mentioned in my previous presentation. SABRE is one that has been announced, and the South Atlantic Express has also been announced. And if you look at the west side of Africa, there's a series of other projects, and I understand that, for example, IOX is a project that's very close to taking off, and that's in the Indian Ocean. The thought here is as follows. When we had a massive cable cut just outside of Alexandria several years ago by an oil tanker, many subsea cables were actually hit, and communications were severely impacted, in particular those of call centers and others that were in India and China coming over, let's say, to Europe and the United States. And at the time we said, wow, would it not make sense to look at another route that doesn't impact latency that much? And hence, instead of using the northern hemisphere to come across, is build networks that go from the Pacific towards South Africa, across the Atlantic, and back up to New York. So several projects have been in the works. SAX has a second project that looks similar in route as IOX. You have the Peace Project, you have Africa 1, Africa 2, Indigo, and others. So there's quite a bit of activity in Africa as well. And I believe the challenges that Africa is going to face are similar to the type of challenges that we used to face in South America, where the terrestrial network was just not there to support the demand of these countries. From a numbers perspective, you will notice here that penetration in Africa is actually the lowest that we have around the world. In that same conversation that I had with my friend about Nigeria, I said, what is it going to take to bring the next 3 billion people online? What is it going to take to bring in some of these African countries online? And basically the thought was, well, if we can get a manufacturer to produce a smartphone for under $50, and we can find additional development money perhaps to build those terrestrial networks, then you're going to start bringing these people online. Otherwise, the countries will continue to struggle in order to get connectivity, let's say, into the region. This map right here basically shows some of these systems that we have talked about. In addition to the ones that have been announced, there's several projects in the works, also led by large-scale OTTs, with a high fiber count. One project rumored to be coming down, let's say, from Marseille, the Middle East, down the east coast of Africa, then coming around similar to the WAC system up north towards Portugal. But in this map right here, you can see both the cables circumnavigating the continent, excuse me, as well as those that are connecting Asia and the Pacific side of the globe, let's say, with the Atlantic side of the globe through Africa. And I think these are very worthwhile projects that we will see in development over the next several years. If you look at this slide, the challenges that I have mentioned before and the challenge that I mentioned for South America are actually quite similar. You need to invest in the terrestrial infrastructure, fiber, data centers, wireless connectivity to be able to reach the population in Africa. Many of the geographies are closed. They're still under a more monopolistic controlled model. So therefore, embracing open market dynamics is very critical. This goes back to what Gil was saying. Open interconnect, neutral interconnect is very critical for the development of some of these areas. And I truly believe that the work that is being done by the OTTs to try to push the market to be more modern, to open up, is definitely going to fix some of the challenges that we see in this region. But it's not an easy region. I think we have seen an awful lot of Chinese investment in Africa. They've realized over the last 10 years that it was not as easy as they thought. To some extent, they may be pulling out, let's say, with respect to some of those investments. And definitely having an information society is critical in one of the largest continents that is still underserved around the world. Ian, would you like to add any to that on the Africa side? Or?
If you flip back one slide. Sorry, the back. Sorry. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think what we see really is, if we step back 10, 15 years, there was the old BRICS route that everybody talked about. And I think what we're seeing is whether it's South Atlantic Express, the first one, and then whether it be IOX, whether it be SAX2, that's sort of modeling that original BRICS route that we all saw. I think,
Can you?
Sorry.
It's
the first time I've been told I'm too quiet.
Thank you for bringing that up, yeah.
Some of you might wish I was quiet, never mind. So the old BRICS route, when 10, 15 years ago, it was extending from, you would say, North America, round the Cape and up into either India or even onwards to China.
Vladivostok was the first design.
Was the first one, right? And all the way through it, right? And
Yep.
we're starting to see that route come back with a virtualized concept, whether it be South Atlantic Express 1 covering the Atlantic side, whether it be IOX or even SAX2 covering this side. So you're starting to see an amalgamation of that original route with different systems. It's also interesting, if you look at SAT3 and SAFE is not actually been overbuilt. We're talking about some more cables going up the East Coast, but we've not actually overbuilt SAFE as a system. So that analogy there, I'd also compare to the LATAM slide where you talked about Curie. That's the first overbuild, I would say, of PAC and SAC as well. So we're starting to see some routes to come in, diversity. And then when you looked at the slide in Africa, there was a lot of activity on the East Coast, not as much on the West Coast, but that's if you look at just over the last 10 years, there was a lot of overbuild on that West Coast to start off with. If we look on the East Coast at the moment, there's really, in terms of significant systems, it's just EASY and CCOM, right? So it shouldn't be a surprise that we're seeing a lot of potential projects on that coastline, just trying to catch up as you balance the two areas. And obviously with the amount of data coming out of Asia, whether it be India generated or China, it makes sense to us all that you're seeing that much activity there. It's how do we decide to route it either south or do we continue up through Egypt and across? So that's what I'll be looking for in the next 18 months is which projects come to fruition and then how we decide to make sure that all the new systems we're building, do we have the diversity through Egypt and all the other different terrestrial ones to bring them to fruition, but also with stability as well.
Thanks, Ian. And so let's use that to pass the baton on to
Ian.
you.
Or Keith. Page down there. That one, okay. So, firstly, thank you very much. I suppose a learning that I realized, when somebody asks you to step in and cover a panel session at 11 o'clock and you say, yeah, because he's a good friend, read the small print would be my guidance here. So A, it wasn't a couple of questions on a panel, it was a presentation. And B, I saw these slides at 5 to 9. So, let's see how we go, right? So, okay, Middle East, Europe and Asia, okay? What we're trying to do is do a quick project coverage of all the new projects. Clearly there's not going to be a lot of bigger ones like we've just seen from, because the bodies of water are quite smaller, but if we just run through this list first of all, you'll see some themes that are coming online. So Eastern Light is very much a Baltic sort of regional interconnect for those of you who are aware of Eastern Light, and it bounces all around the Baltic coastline. So it's trying to connect Sweden, Finland, and then the Baltics and all the way around to Germany. What's interesting about that system, it's an unrepeated festoon, okay? So very high fiber count, being driven as dark fiber, where it's all based on enterprise players trying to sell a fiber per for each one. So it's not a repeated system, but it's complementing the Cinia Sea Lion system, which is a repeated system. So you've got an access ramp and then an express through the middle. So that's where Eastern Light is, and I believe they are at the conference. So if you're looking for Svante, he can give you some certain input there. Orville is in the Mediterranean, built by Algeria Telecom, and that's from Algeria into Spain. That came online either the back end of this year, I believe, or certainly coming online now. I'll be honest, I don't know a great deal about that system, but that's starting to connect across the Straits of Gibraltar. That's interesting when we look at some other concepts which not necessarily listed on this cable, but so as you read a lot of the blogs, Neil and Open Cables is probably the most open in terms of trying to pitch different concepts. Neil was pitching Octopus as a system which was going from Lisbon through into Barcelona and Marseille. Now, why do I mention that system? Neil, in his vision, is trying to create Lisbon as the European equivalent of Fortaleza. Not necessarily a place where you connect and do backhaul through Europe, because bluntly, it's a long way from Lisbon into the typical flap system of Europe, Frankfurt, and all the different ones, right? So it's long, but it could become an optical interconnect for the systems going down to Africa or systems coming through into Europe. So if you looked at the Straits of Gibraltar today, there are only 4 cables that go through there. Columbus, FEA, Seemingly 3, and they're all of the 1999 vintage, and then EIG, which is about 10 years later. So there's only 4 systems that go through that very bit of water. But is it interesting to recreate an equivalent optical interconnect? I'd be interested that Gil, at the end, if you comment on some of the things, because that's the scenario that the guys are pushing there. If we move up into the North Sea, either side of the UK, and if we can all work out what Brexit's going to do, then you're all better than me as to where we end up on that one. But still, we've got Celtics Connect being developed by Aquacoms, and they're trying to build a mesh network that goes from the US into Europe and then onwards into mainland Europe, and be Celtics Connect, or even the North Sea Connect, which comes across from the east coast of the UK and into Denmark. So what Aquacoms are trying to build is complementing their investment in the have-through AEC2 cable by building mesh networks to be able to complement, so you don't have a single point of failure. And for those of you familiar with the North Sea, you've only got a couple of systems that go over the top of the UK. Have-through is really going to be the next generation overbuild of what was historically AC1 North, which is like a 1999 build, and then TAP14 as well, the North system there. So have-through is that overbuild with latest generation capability. And really, Gil alluded to, the evolution of replacement of legacy systems. Slightly different geography again, Diamond Link. For those of you not necessarily familiar with Diamond Link, Marmia is building this system. It's across the Black Sea. Black Sea really is the interconnect between West Europe and East Europe, from Istanbul going all the way across into Azerbaijan and the traditional Eastern European countries. We've used to refer to the Silk Road concept before, whether you're going to come out, say, Pakistan on the peace system and go that way, or do you build terrestrially north through Russia? Well, there's a lot of people looking at, can we build through the Black Sea, so from Istanbul all the way across, there's a short terrestrial connection into the Caspian Sea, and you go across the Caspian and you're into Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and all those countries, and you've almost built a Silk Road interconnect through trying to do a different diverse route. It's a different business model, and certainly we all applaud different ideas of being unique and different capabilities. So that's Diamond Link. Quantum is a system in the Mediterranean. I don't think it's very well known, or you'd have to go and really look and Google Quantum itself, a system being built in the Mediterranean. I think there's a lot more known about Eagle. Eagle is GCX's view of the world from India through to the Mediterranean, sort of an overbuild of what is their FEA system and complementing their Falcon and Hawk system. So I'm pretty sure the GCX team are here this week trying to elaborate on how they're going along with the Eagle system. And then the potential SIMUE 6, I think Neil again was blogging about SIMUE 6 and how that's going, and you can all ring about that. Singtel and usually Orange are 2 of the main drives for that system. So a lot of systems in there, whether they're complementing the North Baltics, whether they are Mediterranean to Asia, or whether they're just trying to connect into Africa. So those are the systems that Keith asked me to talk about on that one. I didn't, he just left me in the lurch, but there you go. EMEA and congestion. So choke points. Marseille is heavily overbuilt at this moment in time. It's a single point of failure. Highly successful, though, you have to say, but we've seen in history that it only takes one significant shipping vessel to take out many cables, right? We've seen that in Egypt. So do you need 2 or 3 optical flexible points where you can have that flexibility? Is Lisbon the right place? A lot of people talk about Genoa as well as an alternative in Italy. I think you have to pick the right place such that the cost of the backhaul is not prohibitive. I think there's a balance between diversity and backhaul, and then a number of backhaul providers. You don't want to end up with just one single one. I would suggest that the carrier is only a single one, would be ecstatic, but not necessarily the best place to be. So congestion is avoiding the on-ramps and off-ramps. You know, you've got EIG at Marseille, then you've got Monaco as another landing one, Toulon. They're all still very similar in location. So how do we avoid that, and how do we avoid the shipping lanes and everything else? And then if you look at the regulatory side, and I always defer to Kent on this, but you know, who knows about the shipping challenges you see around France and the UK? And I think Europe's probably easier to permit, but we've seen other parts of the world which have got significant challenges with permitting and rights of passage. And then finally, the other one we're touching on is the maintenance and repair. How are we actually looking at that? And I would defer to our friends at ASN and Subcom as to how they look at the repair process. But if we're going to go through the systems now, they're going, the fiber count is going up. Does the legacy model for pricing repair on a per fiber per basis, how does that work when you move to SDM? When you get into 16 fiber pairs, is it the same cost and you just divide it and the maintenance price comes down? I'm probably going to get shot now for the people who've got the shipping. But or is it more complex as you put the fiber counts up? So I think it would be a great conversation to see as we make a massive step change from 6 and 8 fiber pair systems into the SDM world of 16 fiber pairs and beyond. What does that mean for maintenance pricing? I think that would be a great topic to understand in terms of, does it help with the OpEx side, okay? And then the time to repair, does that get more complex as we evolve to higher fiber count systems? Do you have to get the different universal joints and all the different cables? That's a great discussion to have, I think. And then just understanding the geopolitical environments. I think that's okay, personally. I think Brexit will entertain us all for the next year and a half in terms of the UK. I don't see a massive change in Europe or outside of the UK. But I think what we should start to see is, if we look at the Arctic Connect, which wasn't on the original list, but Cinia are driving the Arctic Connect system from the top of Finland all the way through the top of Russia and down that side. We've seen Quintillion do something similar in the North Arctic. Does that bring the challenges of maintenance repair? Again, unique routes, very interesting, but how do you do maintenance repair in that kind of scenario as well? So look, short and sweet. I apologize if I didn't cover all the ones that Keith asked me to do, but not bad for 5 minutes notice.
Thanks so much, Ian. We have a jam-packed schedule, and I'm just going to get Andrew up right away. And I think we're going to go over a little bit, so if everybody's okay with it, we'll spend a couple of extra minutes because Ken has some pretty important stuff. So, Andrew, with that.
Thanks very much. So we divided the Pacific into three groupings. The first is what we call Mid and North Pacific. North Pacific basically being cables into Japan, Mid Pacific into Hong Kong, Singapore, more into South Asia. The second grouping then is South Pacific and Australia, and the third will be intra-Asia. So traditionally, historically, most of the cables from Asia to the US were built into Japan, where Japan was the economic powerhouse, and that was the most cost-effective way of building. And of new cables currently under construction, there's one Jupiter, which is being built Japan to direct into LA, with a branch unit to the Philippines, particularly the PLDT. The other three cables that are under construction at the moment are all what we call a Mid-Pacific route, which is direct Hong Kong and Singapore into the US. Today, there's only one cable on that route, which is AAG. And if you think about AAG, it went sort of Hong Kong to Philippines, Guam Guam, Hawaii, mainland US. And that was 10 years ago. Now we're building cables direct express Hong Kong to the US without any landing points in between, which is quite a feat. That route on the mid-Pacific, the main reason for it has been diversity away from Japan, and that's why AAG was successful, and that's what the drivers for those new HK, PLCN, and Beta Bay cables are. So HKA is a direct to Hong Kong to LA with a branching unit into Taiwan. Telstra is actually providing the landing in Taiwan, which we're quite excited about, having a direct from Taiwan to the US route. But also, we will have an overland fibre route from North Taiwan to South Taiwan, linking up to C2C in South Taiwan to Hong Kong, which means we'll have a route bypassing the Luzon Strait, which has historically been an area with a lot of cable cuts. PLCN is the first C+L band cable. I believe it's going to go into service. And Beta Bay is going to be the first direct Singapore to the US cable that doesn't go to Hong Kong or Japan. There's a couple more Singapore to US cables under discussion that haven't been officially announced yet. Moving on to a sort of Australia and South Pacific projects. So the first cable on the list here is Southern Cross Next, which will be a Australia, New Zealand to Los Angeles cable with RFS late 2020. We're quite excited. It was just announced before Christmas that Telstra is joining the Southern Cross Consortium. Still a little asterisk there. It's still that equity acquisition is still going through all the regulatory approvals. But our investment there is specifically to help drive the Southern Cross Next cable. Indigo from Singapore to Perth and Sydney. So that cable just went through its final splicing in December and is now complete in the water end to end, and has just started its commissioning testing. So that is on schedule for a May 2019 RFS. And there's a couple of South Pacific cables. Coral Sea from PNG and Solomon Islands to Sydney. Manitoua from linking up basically Tahiti through to Samoa with branches into Cook Islands in a way. And ICN2, again linking Vanuatu through to the Solomon Islands. Intra-Asia cable projects. Unfortunately, don't have a map for these ones. So the cables that have been announced and are under construction in Intra-Asia. So SJC2, very similar to SJC, sort of a fishbone cable linking up from Japan basically through to Singapore with a lot of branches in between. The Hong Kong, Guam and JGA cables from RTI, basically linking Hong Kong, Japan, Australia, all back into Guam, and also linking up to the SEA US cable from Guam to the US. So all those cables due at the end of this year. The top challenges for the Pacific, and I think there's some similarities to some of the other regions, and I think EMEA in particular. The first was regulatory and geopolitical issues. The long lead time for permitting in China, which is about 2.5 years, and US, approximately 2 years, means long build cycles on cables which are going through those jurisdictions. We're seeing longer and lengthening delays in obtaining repair permits, particularly with cuts inside territorial waters, and cabotage and the need to use locally flagged vessels for repairs. I think in Indonesia has been the poster child for that. Landing site congestion, particularly Singapore and Hong Kong, just with a number of new cable builds. The actual landing areas in both Hong Kong and Singapore are getting congested, and finding locations and places to land cables is becoming a challenge. Open cable system acceptance. So the first of the open cable systems are starting to be delivered, which means we're having to deal with the practicalities or the test and acceptance of those open cables. So that is something which is currently being addressed now, and has highlighted the need for industry standards. There is a working group that's going to present on this at SubOptic, so we'll leave it to them to go into that in a fair bit of detail. And the last, deep sea mining. So with seabed mining blocks being brought up in the Pacific, so new cables have had to deal with with trying to route around those seabed mining blocks, and it is a new issue that is something we now have to deal with. So, given time, we'll leave it there. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, and probably with some of the more robust topics, Kent Bressie will talk about regulatory issues. Thanks, Kent.
Thank you, Tony and Elaine, for organizing everything here. So I'm going to move through this as quickly as possible, as I realize that I am the thing standing between you and coffee and snacks. So with that, I'm going to talk briefly not about the entire universe of interesting regulatory subjects, but a few key topics. In particular, I'm not going to talk at length about some of the permitting challenges for new builds, other than some of the more policy-oriented licensing issues. A lot of those things really haven't changed significantly, other than, as Eric mentioned, we see in certain jurisdictions where there's a loss of expertise, there's a problem. And also in China, not just the long lead times, but now some organizational issues with the creation of the new Ministry of Natural Resources, which has been a less than smooth transition. So I'm going to start off with something that's been in the news a lot, and that is tensions in the US-China relationship and what that means for this industry. There are a lot of security-related concerns that don't have anything to do with the US-China relationship. I'm going to touch on some of those briefly, but a lot of them are driven by this relationship, and the trends are not helpful in terms of new builds and operation. Over the last year or so, we've seen new efforts from the US government to block use of Chinese equipment vendors, not just in the United States, but by US allies. That's now expanding beyond the traditional Five Eyes intelligence allies, including Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and Canada. A lot of the focus has been with terrestrial mobile networks, but the concerns are really universal to any telecommunications network equipment. The US government has expressed concerns as well about China's Belt and Road Initiative and Made in China 2025 plan, not just in terms of building infrastructure, but also Chinese government-led efforts to acquire technology and develop domestic capabilities within China. China, for its part, remains concerned about managing access to information within China by its consumers and businesses, and remains concerned about access by Western content companies to that market, most of them being blocked from operating there. We've seen Australian interventions against China and Chinese vendors in the Solomons and Papua New Guinea, so it's not just the United States that's leading all these initiatives, although certainly there's close coordination between the US and Australia on these issues. In terms of non-China issues, we see US and European concerns about Russian reconnaissance of wet plant. The German government led a workshop late last year focusing on a lot of these concerns in the Baltic, but they're not limited to that area. We see new security and equipment reviews by the Japanese government. The concept of US-style team telecom reviews continue to proliferate. And then there was an enormous amount of controversy in the UK early last year with tabloids having had journalists basically walk into a couple of cable landing stations in Cornwall and make a big fuss about the lack of security there. So there's a lot of churn on these issues, and that means that we're likely to see more regulation in these areas. And the question is, what can this industry do on its own to try to minimize the impact and burden of that? Governments continue to focus on vendor issues for new builds and upgrades. In some cases, we've seen pressure for what we call rip and replace requirements. If there is equipment that governments don't like, they want it removed from a network, and that can be expensive and disruptive. We see restrictions on physical and logical access to networks, increasing interest in compliance with cybersecurity standards, whether that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology standards in the United States, or ISO, International Standards Organization standards. A lot more scrutiny of outages and incident reporting to see if there's malicious or intentional activity, and scrutiny of that. So again, the question is the industry going to wait to see what new regulation comes, or what actions might it take? I know this is going to be discussed at SubOptic as well. It's something that the International Cable Protection Committee is also taking a keen interest in with its new Cable Security Working Group, in which I'm involved. I should have noted at the outset, I'm here not just on behalf of myself and my law firm, but also as the legal advisor for ICPC, a role that I took on last March. So, a favorite topic here, and I'm going to have some new data to share about the agonies of the US team telecom process. This is the US review process from a national security and law enforcement perspective of new submarine cable builds and mergers and acquisitions. This process continues to cause a lot of anxiety and regulatory uncertainty. As we've seen in the past with cycles, we're currently in a phase where the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice are fighting with each other again, which means that everything slows down. Not what you want for your project or for your merger. Part of it is a disagreement about who's in control, but part of it is a substantive disagreement about what issues really need to be addressed in mitigation. DHS also continues to go through reorganizations. DHS has long had the lead for submarine cable-related activities among the three agencies, the other being the Defense Department, which is, I will call them out as a force for good in this process, but they can't control it, unfortunately. But that slows things down as well as staff turnover. Of course, with the federal government shutdown, all of this is suspended right now. And so that's going to add time to all of the pending reviews. And for any applications that are filed in the near future, there are going to be follow-on delays. So the other thing to keep in mind is that if you're operating an older system that doesn't have mitigation, or maybe it has an older form of mitigation, Team Telecom is taking a look at a lot of that, trying to replace older mitigation instruments to impose more modern conditions. Team Telecom continues to conduct site inspections both in the United States and outside the United States with cable landing stations. And there are a lot of other parts of the US government that often want to come and visit and ask questions. That can be disruptive and frustrating when the requests are duplicative. So in terms of licensing times for new systems, Here you have, starting with Monet going forward, the bars with the diagonal sort of faded marks are the ones that are pending. The solid colors are for systems that have already been licensed. You see in blue the amount of time attributable to FCC delay at the front end for reviewing the application before accepting it. At the back end in green, once the security review is done, how long does it take the FCC to act? You can see for the licensed systems and the pending ones that the big source of delay is in pink, Team Telecom. And some of these reviews took a long time or have taken a long time to date. And all of these pending reviews, of course, are suspended right now. Of these systems, CBROS 1 holds the record for the shortest review and licensing time. For the licensed systems, Monet was the longest, although the review to date for PLCN has exceeded that. And just looking at the total number of days, 600 days is a really, really long time to get through this process. And so you need to consult with your advisors if you're doing a new build to sequence things, work with your supplier, and figure out what's a reasonable licensing time. But an unexpected delay like this can be incredibly disruptive. Mergers and acquisitions, the reviews, interestingly, tend to take a lot less time, in part because some of these systems have already been subject to security reviews. So there's simply an interest in updating mitigation and looking at who the new owner is. But there's a wild variation here. And some of this is because there are mergers and acquisitions that involve assets other than submarine cables, and there may be reasons for delay there. So, for example, the T-Mobile Sprint review that's going on right now, submarine cables are obviously not the principal focus there. This is a combination of two large mobile carriers. But again, here most of the delay has been Team Telecom related. Interestingly, the Liberty GCI transaction was not subject to a Team Telecom review because there was not material foreign ownership. But still, some of these review times and the lack of consistency for them can be a problem for mergers and acquisitions. Just a few other comments about what to expect in terms of US regulation. Again, my focus here is more on regulatory issues with the Asia Pacific, and a lot of these do involve the continental United States, Guam, Hawaii, and American Samoa. So we still are having a fight on behalf of the North American Submarine Cable Association, which I advise, with the FCC about outage reporting rules and trying to minimize the burden there. I think we're finally going to see revised final rules adopted this year. I don't think that we're going to be able to eliminate them entirely, but I do think that they will be less burdensome than the version originally adopted. The FCC has sort of made a mess of its capacity reporting requirements. I won't dwell on that, but that continues to be an irritant for licensees. And there are also ongoing problems that are related to capacity reporting with how the FCC manages regulatory fees that everyone has to pay every year. The FCC started in 2016 a rulemaking to revise the Team Telecom process and reform it. That remains stillborn because the current FCC chairman is not particularly interested in the topic. We remain hopeful that either within this administration or with a change in president in the future, that this process can be revived. There are still rumors also that we may see an executive order issued by the president formalizing the Team Telecom process, which could help to bring some certainty to that process and also stabilize the relationship between the three agencies and minimize the fighting among them. And finally, I think we're going to see a rulemaking to reform the FCC's licensing rules. We haven't had one of those for 20 years. They're a little outdated. So shifting more to the international level and drawing on some comments from some of our other panelists, deep seabed mining continues to be an emerging threat to submarine cables, one that has surprised some developers of new systems in the Pacific, in part because deep seabed mining contract areas are not typically charted on nautical charts. It can be very difficult to get information about where exploration activities are currently being conducted, not just the contract areas themselves, but within some of those vast areas, where is their actual activity? Mining contractors don't want to share that. So the concern here is uncoordinated activity, and that can damage cables because even with exploration, you have invasive activities on the seafloor and equipment on the seafloor of a large and, the operations necessary for exploring and developing minerals can easily shred a cable with no knowledge on the part of the operator of that equipment that it had even damaged anything. So deep seabed mining is regulated by the International Seabed Authority, which is established under the Law of the Sea Convention. And it has sort of a conflicted role both as a developer of mining and as a regulator. And its jurisdiction is global. So if you look at the area here in blue, which is the seabed in areas beyond national jurisdiction, that's where the ISA can license mining activities. And so right now the focus has been largely on the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the Eastern Pacific. But it's not just there. We just received notice within ICPC earlier this month of a notification of an application to conduct exploration in the Western Pacific by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. The notification we got tells us nothing about where in the Western Pacific, which is very frustrating. We're glad that we actually received the notice because the ISA has not done that in the past, but we've still got a lot of work to do. And so, again, the activity right now is just exploration, but even that poses a threat. And a lot of our work within ICPC is on the development of the draft exploitation regulations. And that is really the commercialization of the development of minerals on the seafloor, bringing them to the surface, and contributing them in commercial markets. So ICPC has been working intensively on these issues for the last few years. We go twice a year to Jamaica for the annual sessions of the ISA, but we still need cable operators to help educate their governments. This is something that we're going to be providing operators more tools with to use this year. We held a joint workshop with the ISA in Bangkok in October, with a number of folks in the room participating in that, which was fruitful in terms of a direct dialogue between the industries, but there's a lot of work to do. Most importantly, we made a big breakthrough with a joint proposal with the government of France about what the new exploitation regulations should contain with respect to cable protection. It's caused a fair bit of controversy, and a lot of the mining contractors are unhappy about it. But we believe that it is really a critical breakthrough to have a prominent state that is itself a sponsor of mining activities on board with the importance of cable protection. But we need more governments to do that. One other multilateral process going on right now, another odd acronym, BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. This is an effort to regulate the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in the water column in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So it's these same blue areas, but it's not the seabed, it's the water column that we're talking about here. And so this is part of an ongoing treaty negotiation at the UN headquarters in New York. The first session was held in September, which I attended with other ICPC representatives in trying to help shape the treaty to avoid a couple of particular bad outcomes. one particular bad outcome we're concerned about is a requirement for environmental impact assessments on the high seas for new submarine cables. Right now, that only occurs in areas of jurisdiction. And the other concern is restrictions for marine protected areas in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Could there be restrictions on routing through some of those areas? Could add greatly to the costs of new systems and increase their latency and potentially impair their ability to provide diverse connectivity. So this is another area where we need cable operators to educate their governments, and we're already working on a couple of particular tools to help do that in advance of the next treaty negotiation session. There will be 2 of those this year. So our focus to date has really been trying to help educate delegates, because a lot of them have no idea about the importance of submarine cables, particularly to developing countries and to small island states. But we're also focusing on the benign nature, environmental nature of cables, and the potential consequences of trying to regulate them heavily in this kind of a context. One final comment, again, tying back to some comments from our other panelists, and that is a reminder not to forget about traditional cable protection activities and their importance. Activities such as commercial fishing and anchoring are still a major threat to submarine cables. And it's important that governments continue to adopt measures to try to mitigate those threats, in addition to the measures undertaken by the industry itself as sort of self-help. So as an example of that, the government of Singapore convened a workshop for ASEAN member countries in September in connection with the Subnets conference. And I was able to present there talking about the jurisdictional and cable protection elements of the Law of the Sea Convention, and also best practices for promoting submarine cable resilience and reducing repair times. The IMDA, the Singaporean regulator, is now drafting guidelines and working with an experts group. We'd like to see that come to fruition. We'd like to see other countries and regions do that. And here we're talking both about protecting cables, but also ensuring regulatory regimes that promote resilience in other ways, and recognizing the need to do that. Treating cables as critical infrastructure, minimizing cabotage and crew restrictions for vessel operations, minimizing or eliminating customs duties and fees on cable ships and materials. The idea that you would have to import the entire cable ship to do a repair in a particular jurisdiction, I still have a hard time getting my head around. Ensuring that cable operators can pursue route diversity, both routes and landings, and also creating a single point of contact within governments to know who to go to. So there's a lot going on in this space. For the ICPC related items, I urge those organizations that are not members to consider joining. And with the other issues, we need cable operator involvement. So if you have questions, I know we've gone over time, please feel free to find me during the break. If you'd like a copy of my slides, I'm also happy to share them. Thank you.
Elaine, did you want to say anything else? No? Just wrap it up. Come back at 10 of. Okay. With that, I'd like to, we won't have time for questions, so if you have questions for any of the panelists, please catch them after. I would like to thank all of them again for their time and patience today. And I think we've had a fascinating session. And thank all of you for sticking around a little bit late. And thank you both, Elaine and Paul, for guiding me through this process. It went well. Thanks so much. Thank you.
The longest ever is punishment.